Grace Chen checked her watch for the third time in 10 minutes. The hallway outside the audition room remained quiet, except for the muffled sound of a piano and occasional voices from behind the heavy wooden door. Her daughter Lily had been in, there for almost 20 minutes now, playing her prepared pieces for the admissions panel at the prestigious Westfield Conservatory of Music. Please let her do well, Grace whispered to herself, smoothing down the front of her simple blue dress. This audition meant everything to Lily. At 16, she had her heart set on studying piano performance at Westfield, known for producing some of the finest musicians in the country. The conservatory building itself was intimidating, all polished marble floors, wood-paneled walls, and framed photographs of famous alumni who had gone on to perform in the world's greatest concert halls. Grace felt out of place here among the confident young musicians rushing to practice rooms and lessons, instrument cases in hand. She rose from the uncomfortable wooden bench where she'd been waiting and stretched her legs. The hallway was lined with practice rooms, most occupied by students preparing for their own auditions or lessons. Through one partially open door, Grace could see a grand piano sitting unattended, its lid propped open, inviting in the afternoon light that streamed through tall windows. Without really thinking about it, Grace slipped into the room. It had been so long since she'd touched a proper grand piano. Their upright at home was adequate for Lily's practice and Grace's occasional playing, but nothing like this gleaming Steinway. Just for a moment, she told herself, sitting down on the bench. The room smelled of wood polish and possibility. Grace placed her hands on the keys without pressing down, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingers. 20 years melted away in that touch. Before marriage, before children, before the practical decisions that had shaped her adult life. She had been a pianist too, a good one, with scholarships and competition wins that had once seemed like the beginning of something significant. She pressed down gently, playing a simple C, major chord. The sound resonated through the room with a richness her home piano couldn't match. Almost without conscious thought, her fingers began to move through the opening measures of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she had once known by heart, and still played occasionally when the house was empty, and she allowed herself to remember. The music flowed from somewhere deep within her, muscle memory taking over as her hands found the familiar patterns. She closed her eyes, swaying slightly as the beautiful melody filled the practice room. For a moment, she wasn't a 42-year-old mother and wife whose days were filled with grocery shopping and carpools and supporting her husband's career. She was just Grace, the girl who had once lived and breathed music. She was so lost in the piece that she didn't notice the door opening wider or the tall figure standing in the doorway, listening intently. It wasn't until she finished the final, delicate phrase that she became aware she was no longer alone. "Exquisite phrasing," said a deep voice from the doorway. You don't often hear that piece played with such genuine feeling. Grace jumped slightly, her hands lifting from the keys as she turned toward the voice. A man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes was watching her with undisguised interest. His tailored suit and the way he carried himself spoke of authority and confidence. "I'm so sorry," Grace said, quickly standing up from the bench. "I shouldn't have come in here. I was just waiting for my daughter and—" "No need to apologize for beautiful music," the man said, stepping into the room. "Richard Harlow. I chair the piano department here at Westfield." Grace felt her cheeks warm. Of all the people to catch her playing uninvited, it had to be one of the most important figures at the conservatory. "Grace Chen," she replied, shaking his extended hand. "My daughter Lily is auditioning right now for the high school program." "Ah," Professor Harlow said with a nod. "And you're a pianist as well, obviously. Where did you study?" "Oh, Grace hesitated. "I studied at Eastman, but I never finished my degree. Life took me in a different direction." Professor Harlow raised an eyebrow. "Eastman? With whom?" "Professor Margaret Willis." The eyebrow climbed higher. "Willis only took exceptional students. She was quite selective." He studied Grace with renewed interest. "And now you're returning to music?" Grace smiled and shook her head. "No, nothing like that. I'm just here for Lily's audition. I play a bit at home, but that's all." That was considerably more than a bit, Mrs. Chen, Professor Harlow said. Your touch is, well, it's not something that comes from casual playing. Before Grace could respond, a bell chimed somewhere in the building. That's the signal for our afternoon master class, Professor Harlow said. I'm leading a session on Rachmaninoff's piano concertos today. He paused, seeming to make a decision. You should attend. We have several visiting instructors from other conservatories and a few spots for observers. It might give you a better feel for our teaching approach, which would be helpful if your daughter is accepted. Oh, I wouldn't want to intrude, Grace said, though she was intrigued by the idea. How long had it been since she'd been in a room full of serious musicians discussing interpretation and technique? Nonsense. Consider it an invitation, Professor Harlow insisted. Main hall, 3rd floor in 15 minutes. The class runs until 5. Plenty of time before your daughter finishes her full audition process. With that, he nodded politely and left the room, leaving Grace standing somewhat stunned by the piano. She had only meant to touch the keys for a moment, not draw the attention of the department chair. Still, he was right that attending the master class would give her insight into the teaching philosophy at Westfield. If Lily was accepted, Grace wanted to know what kind of musical education her daughter would receive. She left the practice room, carefully closing the door behind her, and returned to the bench outside the audition room. Just as she sat down, the door opened and a young man with a violin case exited, looking relieved. One of the judges appeared in the doorway. We're taking a short break, the woman explained to those waiting. We'll resume auditions in 30 minutes. Grace checked her phone and saw a text from Lily. They're having technical issues with the recording equipment. Taking a break. Don't worry, my playing was going well. With 30 minutes to spare and her daughter's blessing, Grace decided to take Professor Harlow up on his invitation. She found her way to the 3rd floor, following the sound of voices to a large room with rows of chairs facing a small stage area where 2 grand pianos stood side by side. The room was already half full with students and what appeared to be visiting teachers, based on their more formal attire. Grace slipped into a seat in the back row, hoping to observe quietly without drawing attention. She recognized Professor Harlow at the front of the room, speaking with a small group of distinguished-looking men and women, presumably the visiting instructors he had mentioned. As more people filtered in, Grace took in her surroundings. The walls were lined with photographs of famous pianists who had performed or taught at Westfield over the years. The atmosphere hummed with purpose and ambition. Students whispered excitedly to one another, scores open on their laps, fingers, silently practicing difficult passages on imaginary keyboards. It reminded Grace so much of her own student days that she felt a pang of something between nostalgia and regret. She had loved this world once, the intensity of it, the single-minded focus on musical excellence. Had it really been over 20 years since she'd been part of it? At precisely 3 o'clock, Professor Harlow stepped to the center of the performance area, and the room fell silent. Welcome to our special masterclass on Rachmaninoff's piano concertos, he began. We're fortunate to have with us today distinguished faculty from Curtis, Juilliard, and the San Francisco Conservatory. He gestured to the group Grace had seen him speaking with earlier, and they nodded in acknowledgement of the polite applause. Rachmaninoff's concertos represent some of the most technically demanding works in the piano repertoire, Professor Harlow continued. But technical prowess alone is insufficient. These pieces require emotional maturity and interpretive depth as he spoke. His eyes scanned the room, eventually finding Grace in the back row. A small smile of recognition crossed his face before he returned to his introduction. The first student performer, a young man barely out of his teens, took his place at one of the pianos. The second piano would be played by one of the instructors simulating the orchestra parts. The student began the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, his technique impressive but his interpretation somewhat mechanical. After he played, the visiting instructors took turns offering critiques and suggestions. Grace found herself completely absorbed in their comments about phrasing, dynamics, and emotional connection to the music. It was like stepping back into a world she had almost forgotten, where the discussion of a single musical phrase could last 15 minutes and every nuance mattered. 2 more students performed excerpts from different Rachmaninoff concertos, each receiving detailed feedback from the panel. Grace was so engaged that she lost track of time, only remembering to check her phone when there was a brief pause in the proceedings. No messages from Lily. The auditions must still be on. Break. Professor Harlow stepped forward again. Before we continue with our scheduled performers, I'd like to take advantage of having so many different perspectives in the room. We have students, faculty, and even a few guests with us today. His eyes found Grace again, and she felt a sudden uneasiness. In fact, he continued, we have a former Eastman student with us who studied with the legendary Margaret Willis. Perhaps she might favor us with her perspective on the passage we've been discussing from the third concerto. All heads turned, following Professor Harlow's gaze to where Grace sat in the back row. Her heart began to pound as she realized he was talking about her. The new prospect in the back row? He added with a smile that seemed both encouraging and challenging. Would you mind coming down and sharing your thoughts? Perhaps even demonstrating the passage that's been giving our students such difficulty? Grace froze as dozens of pairs of eyes focused on her expectantly. She hadn't come here to perform or participate, only to observe. And the passage they'd been discussing from Rachmaninoff's third concerto was notoriously difficult, one of the most challenging in the entire piano repertoire. She hadn't played it in 20 years. She'd only come to support her daughter. How could she possibly get up in front of all these accomplished musicians and play such a demanding piece? Yet as the silence stretched awkwardly and the expectant faces waited, Grace found herself rising from her seat, her legs carrying her forward as if someone else were controlling them. The walk to the front of the room felt endless, each step bringing her closer to what could only be a humiliating experience. I really don't think, she began quietly as she reached Professor Harlow. Nonsense, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Anyone who plays Chopin the way you do can certainly handle this. Don't worry, we're all friends here. As he guided her toward the piano, Grace caught sight of the sheet music on the stand. The fiendishly difficult cadenza from Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, a passage that had challenged even the greatest pianists in the world. Oh no, she whispered, but Professor Harlow was already introducing her to the room, mistakenly identifying her as a returning pianist considering our adult continuing education program. Before she could correct him, she found herself seated at the gleaming grand piano, facing a room full of elite musicians, with her fingers hovering above keys she never expected to touch again in public. Grace stared at the sheet music before her, the familiar yet intimidating patterns of Rachmaninoff's notes swimming slightly as her heart pounded. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back, waiting, judging, expecting her to fail. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second. I'm sorry, she finally said, turning slightly toward Professor Harlow, who stood nearby, watching her with interest. There's been a misunderstanding. I'm not a student or a prospective student. I'm just here for my daughter's audition. Whispers immediately broke out among the observers. A woman with a severe bun and wire-rimmed glasses, one of the visiting instructors from Juilliard, Grace recalled, leaned forward. Then why are you attending a master class for advanced pianists? She asked, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion. Before Grace could answer, Professor Harlow stepped in. Mrs. Chen was kind enough to accept my invitation when I overheard her playing Chopin in one of our practice rooms. Rather beautifully, I might add. Playing around with Chopin is quite different from handling Rachmaninoff's third, remarked an older gentleman with a bow tie who sat in the front row. Particularly this cadenza passage. Grace felt her cheeks burn. She began to rise from the bench. I should go. I didn't mean to disrupt your class. Nonsense, Professor Harlow said, firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder to keep her seated. You're already here, and I suspect there's more to your musical background than you're letting on. You studied with Margaret Willis at Eastman, after all. At the mention of this name, several of the visiting instructors exchanged glances of surprise and renewed interest. That was a very long time ago, Grace said quietly. 20 years. I haven't played seriously since then. Willis wouldn't have accepted a student without exceptional talent, said the woman with the severe bun. She was known for being ruthlessly selective. And yet here you sit, claiming you can't play this passage, added the bow-tied gentleman, with a hint of challenge in his voice. If you studied with Willis, you should at least be able to attempt it. Grace felt trapped. These people, these elite musicians, thought she was either being falsely modest or deliberately seeking attention. Neither was true, but how could she explain that she had once been capable of playing pieces like this, before life took her in a different direction, before she chose family over career, practical stability over artistic pursuits? She looked down at the keyboard, its black and white pattern so familiar yet suddenly intimidating. Then she glanced at the sheet music again, the infamous cadenza from Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, known for its technical demands and emotional intensity. By some strange coincidence, this had been one of the last pieces she had mastered before stepping away from serious piano study. She had performed it for her final recital at Eastman before leaving the program, but that was 20 years and 2 children ago. Her hands were older now, her technique rusty from years of playing simple pieces for pleasure rather than pushing technical boundaries. "Mrs. Chen?" Professor Harlow prompted. "Just give it a try. This is a learning environment after all." Grace took a deep breath. There seemed to be no graceful way out of this situation. She could either attempt the piece and likely embarrass herself, or refuse and appear arrogant or attention-seeking to this room full of serious musicians. "All right," she said softly, "but please understand I haven't played this in 20 years. It won't be what you're expecting." She adjusted the bench, a small act that brought back muscle memory from her student days. Her hands hovered over the keys as she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to recall how this piece had once felt under her fingers, how the complex patterns had made sense, how the emotional arc of the cadenza told a story of struggle and triumph. When she opened her eyes, she focused only on the music, shutting out the watching faces, the expectations, the judgment. Her fingers found the opening notes of the cadenza, the deceptively simple beginning that soon bloomed into cascading arpeggios and complex harmonies. The first few measures were hesitant, her fingers slightly stiff and uncertain, but as she continued, something remarkable began to happen. Her hands remembered what her conscious mind had forgotten. Years of rigorous training reasserted themselves, muscle memory taking over as her fingers found their way through the intricate passages. The room around her disappeared as Grace surrendered to the music. This piece had always spoken to her, its moments of tenderness contrasting with passages of almost violent intensity, its technical challenges serving the emotional expression rather than mere showmanship. As she played, she felt something awakening inside her, a connection to her younger self and to the music that had once been the center of her world. Her body swayed slightly as she navigated the most difficult sections, her eyes occasionally closing as she gave herself over to feeling rather than thinking. The rich sounds of the Steinway filled the room, building to the powerful climax of the cadenza before resolving into the gentler passage that would normally lead back to the orchestra's entrance. As the final notes faded, Grace became aware of the complete silence in the room. She kept her head down, afraid to look up and see the judgment on the faces of these accomplished musicians. Her performance hadn't been perfect. She had simplified a few of the most difficult passages, missed a few notes in the fastest sections. Surely these experts had heard every flaw. "My God," whispered someone behind her. Grace finally looked up to find Professor Harlow staring at her with an expression of complete astonishment. The room remained utterly silent, every face reflecting some mixture of surprise, confusion, or outright shock. The bow-tied gentleman was the first to speak. "Where did you say you studied?" "Eastman," Grace replied, her voice barely audible. "But I didn't finish. I left after my 3rd year." "Why?" asked the woman with the severe bun, leaning forward with intense interest. "With that kind of facility, why would you leave?" The question hit Grace like a physical blow. It was the same question she had asked herself during sleepless nights over the years, the same question that occasionally haunted her when she heard remarkable performances or saw her former classmates' names on concert programs. "Life happened," she said simply. I got married. My husband's job took us across the country. Then children came. I chose a different path." "What a waste," muttered someone in the back of the room, not quite quietly enough. Grace felt her shoulders stiffen at the words. Before she could respond, Professor Harlow stepped forward. "Not a waste," he said firmly. "A choice. And based on what we just heard, clearly not an abandonment of music entirely." He turned to Grace. "Mrs. Chen, that was exceptional. Especially for someone who claims not to have played seriously in decades." The woman with the severe bun nodded in agreement. "Your technique is understandably rusty in spots, but your musical instincts are remarkable. The phrasing, the understanding of the architecture of the piece. Those things can't be taught. You either have them or you don't. And you clearly have them," added the bow-tied gentleman, his earlier skepticism replaced with genuine respect. "I've heard professional recordings of that cadenza with less emotional truth." Grace felt overwhelmed by their comments. For so long she had tucked away this part of herself, the serious musician she had once been and sometimes still longed to be. She had convinced herself that her choice to prioritize family had necessarily meant the death of her artistic identity. But sitting here now receiving validation from some of the country's top music educators, she wondered if perhaps she had been wrong. "Thank you," she said, not knowing what else to say. The door at the back of the room suddenly opened, and a young woman with a clipboard peered in. "Professor Harlow? The auditions are resuming in 5 minutes. You asked to be notified." "Yes, thank you," he replied, then turned back to Grace. "You mentioned your daughter is auditioning today." Grace nodded, suddenly remembering why she was here in the first place. "Yes, Lily Chen, for the high school program." "Well, if she has inherited even a fraction of your musicality, I look forward to hearing her," Professor Harlow said with a smile. "Now, before you go, would you consider coming back next week? We're having a faculty showcase concert. Nothing formal, just an opportunity for our teachers and some guests to perform and share ideas. I think everyone here would be very interested to hear you play something more substantial." Grace blinked in surprise. "Me? Perform at a faculty showcase? But I'm not faculty, I'm not even a professional musician." "Perhaps not currently," said the woman with the severe bun, "but you most certainly were trained as one. And based on what we just heard, that training hasn't been entirely lost." "Just think about it," Professor Harlow urged. "You clearly still have music inside you that deserves to be heard." Grace nodded non-committally as she rose from the piano bench. "I should go find my daughter. Thank you for this unexpected opportunity." As she made her way toward the door, students and faculty alike watched her with newfound respect and curiosity. She could hear whispers following her. "Who is she really? Did you hear that phrasing in the middle section? How can someone not play seriously for 20 years and still sound like that?" In the hallway, Grace leaned against the wall for a moment, her heart still racing. What had just happened in there? She had expected embarrassment, maybe even humiliation. Instead, she had reconnected with a part of herself she had long suppressed. The artist who lived beneath the roles of mother, wife, and household manager. Her hands were trembling slightly, both from the physical exertion of playing such a demanding piece and from the emotional aftermath. It had felt so good to really play again, to lose herself in music that challenged and fulfilled her. When was the last time she had experienced that feeling, Mom? Grace looked up to see Lily hurrying down the hallway toward her, a concerned expression on her face. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere. My audition is about to start up again and—" Lily paused, studying her mother's face. "Are you okay? You look weird." Grace laughed, a slightly breathless sound. "I'm fine. Just, I got roped into playing piano for a master class while I was waiting for you." "You what?" Lily's eyes widened. "You played? Here? In front of people?" "It's a long story," Grace said, straightening up and smoothing down her dress. "I'll tell you all about it later. Right now we need to get you back to your audition." As they walked quickly toward the audition room, Lily glanced sideways at her mother. Was it scary, playing in front of all those serious music people? Grace considered the question. Yes, she admitted. But also, wonderful. I'd forgotten how it feels to really play. To play something challenging that takes everything you have. Lily smiled. That's how I feel when I play, like I'm fully alive. Yes, Grace said softly, recognizing the truth in her daughter's words. Exactly like that. As they reached the audition room door, Grace gave Lily a quick hug. Go show them how amazing you are. I'll be right out here. Where else would you be? Lily asked with a smile before disappearing into the room. Where else indeed, Grace thought as she settled back onto the waiting bench. But as she sat there, Professor Harlow's invitation echoed in her mind. A faculty showcase. A chance to really play again. To prepare and perform serious repertoire for an audience that would understand what they were hearing. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Could she do it? Should she? What would David, her husband, think about her suddenly, stepping back into a world she had left behind decades ago? Grace didn't have answers to these questions yet, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine possibilities beyond the careful, orderly life she had built. Perhaps there was room for her to be both the devoted wife and mother she had chosen to be and the serious musician she had once been. Perhaps it wasn't too late to reclaim that part of herself after all. The drive home from the conservatory was filled with Lily's excited chatter about her audition. She bounced in the passenger seat, reliving each moment for her mother as Grace navigated the evening traffic with half her attention. And then, Professor Wilson. She's the one with the really curly hair. She actually smiled when I finished. The Beethoven. That has to be a good sign, right? And they asked me all these questions about my practice routine and what composers inspire me, and I think I answered okay, but I'm not sure if... Lily paused, finally noticing her mother's distraction. Mom? Are you even listening? Of course I am, Grace said, pulling herself back to the present. Professor Wilson smiled at your Beethoven. That's great, honey. Okay, but you seem weird. You've been weird ever since I found you in the hallway. Lily studied her mother with teenage directness. What really happened in that master class? Grace sighed as she stopped at a red light. How could she explain today's experience when she barely understood it herself? I told you I somehow got roped into playing for Professor Harlow's class. It was unexpected. Yeah, but you're acting like something huge happened. Did you mess up really badly or something? No, Grace said quietly. Grace, just the opposite, actually. They liked my playing. A lot. Well, duh, Lily said, rolling her eyes affectionately. You're amazing. I've been telling you that forever. This was different, Grace tried to explain. These weren't just nice comments from a daughter who loves her mom. These were serious musicians, teachers at top conservatories. And they thought I was good. Really good. Because you are, Lily insisted. Why is that so hard for you to believe? The light turned green and Grace drove on, considering her daughter's question. Why was it so hard to believe? Perhaps because she had spent 20 years convincing herself that her musical talent was just a phase of her youth, something to be set aside for more practical concerns. Perhaps because she had worked so hard to be content with her choices that acknowledging she might have been good enough for a different path was too painful. Professor Harlow invited me to play in a faculty showcase next week, she finally said, as they turned onto their street. Lily gasped. Mom, that's huge. Are you going to do it? I don't know, Grace admitted. It seems crazy. I'm not faculty. I'm not even a professional musician. But you could have been, Lily said quietly. The simple truth in those 4 words hung in the air between them as Grace pulled into their driveway. The modest 2-story house was lit up from within, a warm welcome after the emotional day. We're home, Lily called out as they entered through the side door into the kitchen. The smell of garlic and ginger filled the air. David Chen looked up, from the stove where he was stir-frying vegetables. At 45, he had a few strands of gray at his temples but still maintained the lean build of the college tennis player Grace had fallen in love with 2 decades earlier. There are my favorite musicians, he said with a smile. How did the big audition go? Lily launched into her detailed recap again as she dropped her bag on a kitchen chair and grabbed a piece of bell pepper from the cutting board. Grace set her purse down more carefully and moved to get plates from the cabinet, her mind still swirling with the day's events. They asked really specific questions about my musical influences, Lily was saying. And I mentioned how Mom was my first teacher and biggest influence, and they seemed to like that answer. David raised an eyebrow at Grace. High praise from our daughter, though well-deserved. He turned down the heat under the wok. And how was your day, sitting in those uncomfortable hallway chairs? Grace hesitated, suddenly unsure how to share her experience. Would David understand the significance of what had happened? Would he support her if she decided to accept Professor Harlow's invitation? Mom played Rachmaninoff for a master class and totally blew everyone away, Lily announced before Grace could respond. And now they want her to perform in some fancy faculty concert. David's spatula froze mid-stir. What? Grace shot Lily a look that said, "We were going to ease into that," then turned to her husband. "It's not as dramatic as she makes it sound. I got mistaken for a prospective student and somehow ended up playing for Professor Harlow's masterclass. It was awkward and unexpected, but turned out okay." "Okay?" Lily exclaimed. "Mom, the way you described it, they were practically falling over themselves afterwards." David turned off the stove completely and gave Grace his full attention. "You played? In public? After all these years?" There was no judgment in his voice, just genuine surprise and something else. Curiosity, perhaps. "It wasn't planned," Grace explained. "Professor Harlow caught me playing in an empty practice room while waiting for Lily. Then he invited me to observe his master class, and somehow I ended up at the piano. Playing the Rachmaninoff cadenza," Lily added. "The super hard one." David's expression softened into a smile. "I wish I could have seen that. You playing Rachmaninoff again after all these years?" His reaction caught Grace off guard. She had expected confusion, maybe even concern about her suddenly stepping back into a world she had left behind. Instead, he seemed almost proud. "So tell me about this showcase," he said, returning to the stove to finish dinner. "When is it?" "Next Friday evening," Grace replied, still trying to gauge his reaction. "But I haven't decided if I'm going to do it. It seems presumptuous. Me performing alongside actual professors and professionals." David plated the stir-fry and carried it to the table. "Why wouldn't you do it? Sounds like an amazing opportunity." "Because I'm not a real musician anymore," Grace said, the words coming out more sharply than she intended. "I'm a mom who plays piano sometimes. I haven't seriously practiced in 20 years. You didn't sound like a mom who plays piano sometimes today," Lily pointed out as they sat down to eat. "You sounded like a real musician to a room full of experts." David reached across the table and took Grace's hand. "You've always been a real musician, Grace. Having a family didn't change that. It just changed how much time you had to devote to it." Grace felt unexpected tears prick her eyes at his words. "But I'd have to practice, really practice, hours every day like I used to. Our schedule is already so tight with your work and Lily's activities and all the household stuff I manage. So we adjust," David said simply. "I can cook more often. Lily can take on more chores. I can totally do my own laundry," Lily offered. "I'm 16, not 6. And I can handle the grocery shopping on my way home from work," David added. "We're a team, remember? We support each other's dreams." Grace looked between her husband and daughter, overwhelmed by their immediate willingness to rearrange their lives to make space for her music. "But what would I even play?" she wondered aloud. "I'd need something substantial enough for a faculty showcase, but realistic enough to prepare in a week." "What about that Chopin piece you always play when you think no one's listening?" Lily suggested. "The really emotional one that sounds like rain?" "The Ballade in G minor?" Grace asked, surprised that Lily had paid such close attention. "Yeah, that one. You already know it and you play it beautifully." David nodded in agreement. "I love when you play that piece. It's like hearing you speak in a different language, one that's somehow more you than your everyday voice." Grace felt something shift inside her at their words, a permission she hadn't realized she'd been waiting for. an acknowledgement of a part of herself she had kept carefully contained for years. "I'd need to polish it significantly," she said, allowing herself to consider the possibility. "The middle section has those fiendish runs that I've been simplifying." "So you'll practice," David said. "We'll make it work." After dinner, while David and Lily handled the dishes, Grace found herself drawn to the upright piano in their living room. It was a decent instrument, not a concert grand by any means, but well-maintained and regularly tuned. She sat on the bench and opened the fallboard, revealing the keys that had been her solace and joy throughout the years of carpools and homework help and household management. She began to play the Chopin ballade softly, feeling the familiar patterns under her fingers. Yes, this could work for the showcase. It was technically demanding, but not impossible to prepare in a week, especially since she already knew the notes. And emotionally, it spoke to her, its narrative quality telling a story of conflict, yearning, and ultimately, transformation. As she played, Grace became aware of David and Lily standing in the doorway listening. She didn't stop or acknowledge them, allowing herself instead to be fully present with the music in a way she rarely permitted. The piece built to its tumultuous conclusion, her fingers flying across the keys and the coda's rapid-fire notes. When she finished, Lily broke the silence. "That's it. That's what you have to play for the showcase." David nodded in agreement. "If you can play it like that after a day's work with no warm-up, imagine what you could do with focused practice." Grace looked down at her hands, these hands that had changed diapers and prepared countless meals and helped with school projects, but had also once been capable of creating beauty through music. Perhaps they still were. "All right," she said finally. "I'll call Professor Harlow tomorrow and accept his invitation." The week that followed upended the Chen household's carefully calibrated routine. True to their word, David and Lily took on more household responsibilities, creating pockets of time for Grace to practice. She started waking up at 5:30 each morning to get in 2 hours at the piano before the day began, and spent her evenings working on the most challenging passages of the ballade. By Wednesday, her hands were aching in a way they hadn't in years. A deep familiar soreness in the muscles and tendons that reminded her of her conservatory days. She dug out her old metronome and practice journals, relearning the disciplined approach to preparation that had once been second nature. On Thursday afternoon, she received a call from Professor Harlow. "Mrs. Chen, I'm calling to confirm your participation in tomorrow's showcase," he said, "and to inform you that there's been significant interest in your performance." "Interest?" Grace repeated, pausing in the middle of chopping vegetables for dinner. "What kind of interest?" "Word has spread about your impromptu performance in our master class," he explained. "Several faculty members who weren't present have expressed curiosity, and I believe your daughter's audition panel is particularly interested, given that she mentioned you were her first teacher." Grace felt a flutter of nerves. "How many people are expected to attend?" "The recital hall seats 300, Professor," Harlow replied casually. "We're anticipating a full house." Grace nearly dropped the phone. 300 people? She had been preparing with a small faculty gathering in mind, perhaps 50 people at most. The prospect of playing for a full recital hall after 20 years away from public performance was terrifying. "Professor, I don't think You'll be magnificent," he interrupted firmly. "Remember how you played the Rachmaninoff when you weren't even prepared? Imagine what you can do with a piece you've chosen and practiced." After hanging up, Grace sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly overwhelmed. What had she gotten herself into? She had been a promising student once, yes, but that was decades ago. Now she was preparing to perform for hundreds of people who represented the elite of the music education world. People who would judge not just her playing, but the life choices that had led her away from music as a profession. When David came home, he found her still sitting there, the half-chopped vegetables forgotten, on the cutting board. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down his briefcase. 300 people, she said numbly. "The showcase is in their main recital hall, and they're expecting 300 people." David sat down across from her. "And that changes things how? The notes are the same whether there are 3 people listening or 3,000. That's what my professor used to say, Grace said with a small smile. But it's been so long, David. What if I freeze? What if I embarrass myself? What if I embarrass Lily? You won't, he said with absolute certainty. But even if something goes wrong, even if you forget every note of the piece, we'll still be there. Proud of you for trying. For being brave enough to step back onto that stage after all these years. Grace looked at her husband. This man, who had never once made her feel like she had sacrificed her talent for their family, who had always encouraged her to keep music in her life, in whatever way felt right. I'm terrified, she admitted. Good, he said with a smile. That means it matters. On Friday evening, the Chen family arrived at Westfield Conservatory an hour before the showcase was scheduled to begin. Grace wore a simple black dress, her nice occasion standby, freshly pressed for the evening. David and Lily were equally dressed up, understanding the significance of the event. Professor Harlow met them in the lobby, his eyes approving as he took in Grace's appearance. Our final performer has arrived, he said. Come, I'll show you the green room where you can warm up before the program begins. As they walked through the conservatory's elegant hallways, Grace's nervousness was tempered by a growing sense of rightness. Whatever happened tonight, she was reclaiming a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. She was honoring not just the talented girl she had once been, but the woman she had become. A woman whose life experiences would inform her performance in ways her younger self could never have understood. The green room was already occupied by several other performers, distinguished faculty members and guest artists who eyed Grace with undisguised curiosity. As she sat down to warm up her hands on the practice piano in the corner, she overheard one whispered conversation. That's her, the housewife who played the Rachmaninoff cadenza. Is she really that good, or was Harlow exaggerating? Guess we'll find out soon enough. Grace closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, shutting out the whispers. Tonight wasn't about proving anything to these people. It was about reconnecting with the musician she had always been, beneath the layers of other identities she had accumulated over the years. As David and Lily left to find their seats in the auditorium, David leaned down and kissed her cheek. Play for yourself tonight, he whispered, just like you do at home when you think no one is listening. His words centered her, reminding her why she had agreed to this in the first place. Not for acclaim or validation from strangers, but for the pure joy of making music. The joy she had never completely lost, even during the busiest years of raising a family. As she waited for her turn to perform, listening to the other musicians from backstage, Grace felt a strange calm settle over her. Whatever happened next, she had already won the most important battle, the one against her own fear and self-doubt. She was here, ready to play, ready to be seen as the complete person she was. Mother, wife, and musician. When Professor Harlow finally announced her name, describing her as a remarkable pianist whose journey has taken her away from the concert stage but never away from music itself, Grace walked onto the stage with her head held high, ready to show the world what a mother who plays piano can really do. The lights of the recital hall seemed impossibly bright as Grace walked across the polished wooden stage. 300 faces looked back at her from the audience, their expressions a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and anticipation. She spotted David and Lily in the fifth row, both giving her encouraging smiles. Her family's confidence steadied her nerves as she approached the gleaming concert grand piano at center stage. This instrument was far superior to her home upright or even the practice piano in the green room. A Steinway Model D, the pinnacle of concert pianos waiting for her touch. Grace adjusted the bench carefully, taking her time establishing herself in the space. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, took a deep breath, and then positioned them over the keys. In that suspended moment before she began to play, Grace thought of all the paths that had led her here. The young girl who fell in love with music, the promising student who left conservatory for marriage, the mother who kept music alive in stolen moments between responsibilities. All of these versions of herself were present now as her fingers pressed down on the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The piece began gently, almost questioningly, the perfect musical expression of Grace's own tentative return to the concert stage. As the opening phrases unfolded, she felt a moment of disconnect. The magnificent piano responding differently than her familiar instrument at home, the acoustics of the hall carrying the sound in ways her living room never could. For a few measures she played cautiously, getting her bearings in this new landscape. But then something remarkable happened. The piano began to feel like an extension of herself, responsive to her slightest intention. The hours of practice that week had refreshed her muscle memory, but there was something more happening now, a deeper connection to the music that transcended mere preparation. As Grace moved into the more dramatic middle section of the ballade, her body swayed slightly with the surging emotions of the piece. Her fingers found the challenging runs and arpeggios with increasing confidence, her mind staying just ahead of her hands, anticipating each musical moment before it arrived. This was what she had loved about performing, this sense of being simultaneously in complete control and completely surrendered to the music. She was no longer aware of the audience. The years fell away, and she was simply a musician expressing the composer's intentions through her own understanding and experience. The technical difficulties that had worried her during practice now served the emotional narrative of the piece. Her left hand created a foundation of rich harmonies while her right hand sang out the melodic line with a voice that was uniquely her own. When she reached the most technically demanding passage, a section of rapid-fire notes that cascaded down, the keyboard like summer rain, Grace felt a moment of pure joy. Her fingers flew across the keys with a freedom and precision that surprised even her. The hours of careful, methodical practice had paid off, but there was magic happening beyond technique alone. The final section of the ballade built toward its tumultuous conclusion, the music growing more urgent and complex. Grace poured everything into these final moments, all her regrets about paths not taken, all her gratitude for the life she had chosen, all her newfound courage in reclaiming this part of herself. Her body was fully engaged now, her emotions transparent as she drove toward the powerful final chords. When the last notes resonated through the hall, Grace kept her hands on the keys for a moment, reluctant to break the spell. Then she slowly lowered them to her lap, her head bowed slightly, her breathing uneven from the physical and emotional exertion of the performance. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Had she misjudged? Had her performance failed to meet the expectations of this sophisticated audience? Just as doubt began to creep in, the hall erupted in applause. Not the polite acknowledgement given to the other performers, but a spontaneous, enthusiastic response that caught Grace by surprise. She rose from the bench and turned to face the audience, most of whom were now on their feet. In the fifth row, David was applauding with unabashed pride, and Lily was jumping up and down, her face radiant. Across the aisle, Grace spotted Professor Harlow nodding with satisfaction, as if her performance had confirmed something he had suspected all along. As the applause continued, Grace took a second bow, then a third. When she finally left the stage, her legs felt unsteady, a combination of adrenaline and relief making her lightheaded. In the green room, the other performers, distinguished faculty members who had played earlier in the program, greeted her with genuine respect. "Magnificent interpretation," said an older gentleman who had performed a complex Bach fugue. "Such emotional depth." "Where have you been hiding?" asked a woman who taught violin at Juilliard. "That kind of musicality is rare." Before Grace could respond, Professor Harlow entered the green room, followed by several other conservatory faculty members. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his usual formality softened by genuine warmth. "That was everything I hoped it would be and more." "Thank you," Grace replied, still feeling somewhat dazed by the experience. The piano was wonderful to play. "It wasn't the piano," said a stern-looking woman whom Grace recognized as the chair of the performance department. "It was the pianist. You have a remarkable gift." As the faculty members continued their praise, Grace caught snippets of their conversation when they thought she couldn't hear. Wasted potential, really. Imagine what she could have become. Still time for a late career. Their words stirred mixed emotions. Yes, She had stepped away from a potential performing career. Yes, there were moments over the years when she had wondered, what if? But wasted? No. Her life had been full in different ways, rich with family, community, the quiet satisfactions of watching her daughter develop her own musical gifts. The green room door opened again, and David and Lily burst in, ignoring protocol in their excitement. Lily threw her arms around her mother. "Mom, that was incredible. Everyone was blown away." David embraced them both, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I've heard you play that piece 100 times at home, but never like that." It was like hearing it for the first time. As Grace basked in her family's pride, Professor Harlow approached with a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. "Mrs. Chen, I'd like to introduce Dean Williamson, head of the Conservatory." The dean shook Grace's hand firmly. "That was quite a performance, Mrs. Chen. Professor Harlow told me about your impromptu Rachmaninoff earlier this week, but I admit I was skeptical. I'm not skeptical anymore." "Thank you," Grace said, unsure what else to say. "We're having a small reception for the performers and some special guests," the dean continued. "I hope you and your family will join us. There are several people very interested in meeting you." As they followed the dean out of the green room, David leaned close to Grace. "Did you see Lily's face during your performance? I don't think I've ever seen her look so proud." Grace glanced at her daughter, who was walking ahead with Professor Harlow, animatedly discussing the technical aspects of the ballad. "It's strange," she whispered back. "I always thought my stepping back from music was partly for her, to be the kind of present, available mother I thought she needed. But maybe seeing me reconnect with my passion is just as valuable for her." The reception was held in an elegant room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the conservatory's moonlit gardens. Faculty members, distinguished alumni, and major donors mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Grace found herself at the center of attention, answering questions about her musical background and why she had stepped away from serious performance. She answered honestly, without apology or regret. "Life offers many paths," she explained to a particularly persistent donor who couldn't understand why she had thrown away her talent. "I chose one that included marriage and motherhood as priorities. Music remained important, just in a different way." "But surely you regret not pursuing a concert career," the woman pressed, "especially after hearing the audience response tonight." Grace considered the question carefully. "I don't frame it as regret," she said finally. "I'm grateful for the life I've built. And now I'm discovering that perhaps the choice isn't as binary as I once thought. Maybe there's room for both family and more serious musical pursuits, just at different seasons of life." As the evening progressed, Grace noticed Lily deep in conversation with the stern woman who chaired the performance department. They appeared to be discussing something intensely, with occasional glances in Grace's direction. Eventually, they approached together. "Mrs. Chen," the department chair began, "your daughter has been telling me about your teaching approach. She credits you with her strong foundation and musical sensitivity." Grace smiled at Lily. "She's a wonderful student, very dedicated." "Yes, well, that much was evident in her audition," the woman continued. "What interests me is her description of your teaching methods, particularly for young beginners. We have been discussing revisions to our community music school program, which provides lessons to children from ages 5 to 18. Grace nodded, not quite following where this was headed. "We find ourselves in need of a piano instructor who understands how to build solid technique while nurturing musicality from the very beginning," the woman explained. "Someone who can work with our youngest students and prepare them for our more advanced teachers. Based on what I heard tonight and what your daughter has shared, I believe you might be an excellent fit." Grace blinked in surprise. "Are you offering me a teaching position?" "A part-time one, yes. 4 afternoons a week working with our beginning and intermediate students in the community program. You would have considerable freedom in your teaching approach while following our general curriculum guidelines." The unexpected offer left Grace momentarily speechless. "Teaching at Westfield Conservatory?" It was so far from anything she had imagined. For herself, especially after 2 decades away from the professional music world. "I'd need to think about it," she said finally. "Discuss it with my family." "Of course," the department chair replied. "But don't take too long. We need someone to start with the new term in 3 weeks." As the woman walked away, Lily could barely contain her excitement. "Mom, can you believe it? You could be teaching at Westfield. We might both be here next year." "It's certainly unexpected," Grace acknowledged, still processing the possibility. David joined them, catching the end of Lily's enthusiastic outburst. "What's this about teaching?" As Grace explained the offer, she watched her husband's face carefully, looking for any sign of concern or hesitation. Instead, she saw only supportive interest. "It sounds perfect," he said when she finished. "Part-time, doing what you love, sharing your gift with children. What's holding you back?" Grace considered his question. What was holding her back? Fear of change? Uncertainty about her qualifications after so long away from formal music education? Or perhaps, a deeper fear, that stepping back into this world might awaken regrets she had carefully kept at bay all these years? "I'm not sure I belong here," she admitted quietly. Among all these people who dedicated their entire lives to music. Professor Harlow, who had approached in time to hear her words, shook his head firmly. "After what we all witnessed tonight, there should be no question about where you belong, Mrs. Chen. You may have taken a different path, but your performance proved that music has remained at the core of who you are. The Conservatory would be fortunate to have someone with your combination of musical insight and life experience teaching our young students." As the evening drew to a close, Grace found herself standing by the grand piano that had been moved to the reception area. Without conscious thought, her hand reached out to touch the polished surface, feeling the connection to the instrument that had been the center of her world for so many years. "Play something else," Lily urged, noticing the gesture. "Just one more piece." The room quieted as Grace sat down at the piano. This time there were no nerves, no pressure to prove herself. She began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, its gentle, impressionistic tones perfectly matching the moonlight streaming through the windows. As the beautiful, familiar piece filled the room, Grace felt a profound sense of rightness, as if separate. Pieces of her life were finally coming together in unexpected harmony. The mother, the wife, the teacher, the performer, all aspects of one whole person. When she finished playing, the applause was warm, but quieter than before, respectful of the intimacy of the moment. Grace rose from the piano with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Whatever she decided about the teaching position, whatever new direction her life might take from this point forward, one thing was certain. Music would no longer be confined to the margins of her existence. She had reclaimed her voice, and it was still strong, still uniquely hers, perhaps even richer for the years of silence. 3 months had passed since Grace's unexpected performance at the Westfield Conservatory Faculty Showcase. The spring afternoon, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of her teaching studio, catching dust motes that danced in the air as a young girl struggled through a Bach minuet on the studio's upright piano. "Remember what we talked about with the left hand, Zoe?" Grace said gently. "It needs to support the melody, not compete with it. Try thinking of it as the bass section in an orchestra." The 8-year-old nodded seriously and began again, her small hands more coordinated this time as she found the balance between the hands that had eluded her moments before. "Yes, much better," Grace encouraged. "Do you hear how the melody sings out more clearly now?" Zoe smiled, her concentration momentarily broken by pride in her improvement. "It sounds more like music and less like just notes." "Exactly," Grace agreed. "That's always our goal, to make music, not just play notes." As Zoe continued working through the piece, Grace glanced at the clock on the wall. This was her last student of the day, the final lesson in a busy afternoon of teaching at the Conservatory's community music school. In the 3 months since she had accepted the position, she had quickly built a reputation as one of the most sought-after teachers for beginning and intermediate students. Parents appreciated her patience and structured approach. Children responded to her genuine enthusiasm and ability to make technical concepts accessible. What had begun as a part-time position teaching 4 afternoons a week had gradually expanded to include a Saturday morning group class and several advanced students who had specifically requested to work with her. When Zoe's lesson ended, Grace walked her to the door where her father waited. "She's making wonderful progress," Grace told him, "especially with balancing the hands independently." "She practices more willingly since she started with you," the father replied. "Whatever magic you're working, please keep it up." After they left, Grace tidied her studio, organizing sheet music and jotting down notes for the next day's lessons. The space had become a second home to her, a room filled with sunlight, music, and the energy of young people discovering their own musical voices. On the wall hung a framed program from the faculty showcase, a tangible reminder of the night that had changed everything. As she gathered her things to leave, there was a knock at the open door. Grace looked up to see Professor Harlow standing, there his tall figure silhouetted against the hallway light. "Mrs. Chen," he said with a nod. "I hope I'm not interrupting your day." "Not at all," Grace replied, gesturing for him to enter. "I just finished my last lesson." Professor Harlow stepped into the studio, his eyes taking in the space with approval. The carefully organized music books, the inspirational quotes about practice and perseverance posted on the walls, the small keyboard diagram she used to help students visualize concepts away from the piano. "Your studio reflects your teaching philosophy," he observed. "Organized but warm, disciplined but encouraging." Grace smiled. "Thank you. I've tried to create the kind of space I would have wanted as a young student." "Well, it seems to be working. The feedback from parents has been exceptionally positive." Professor Harlow paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Which is partly why I'm here today. The faculty committee has been discussing next year's curriculum and staffing." Grace nodded, waiting for him to continue. "We would like to offer you a permanent position beginning in the fall," he said. "Full-time, with benefits. You would continue with your current community music school students, but also take on several conservatory track high school students and teach a weekly masterclass on early advanced repertoire." Grace sat down slowly on the piano bench, surprised by the offer. "That's very flattering, Professor, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of teaching. I don't have the advanced degrees that your other faculty members have." "Degrees are one form of qualification," Professor Harlow acknowledged, "but they're not the only form. Your performance at the showcase demonstrated your musical understanding at the highest level, and these past 3 months have proven your exceptional ability to communicate that understanding to others." He sat in one of the student chairs near the piano. "The truth is, Mrs. Chen, we have plenty of technically proficient pianists with impressive academic credentials. What we lack are teachers who can bridge the gap between technical proficiency and, especially for students at critical developmental stages." Grace ran her fingers lightly over the piano keys without pressing them down, a habit she had when thinking deeply. The offer was both tempting and terrifying. A full-time position would mean a significant change to her family's daily rhythms, to the household responsibilities she had managed primarily on her own for years. "I would need to discuss this with my family," she said finally. "Of course," Professor Harlow agreed. "But there's one more thing you should know before you make your decision." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a formal-looking envelope. "This arrived yesterday. I thought you should see it immediately." Grace took the envelope, noting the official letterhead of the Westfield Conservatory Admissions Department. She looked up questioningly. "It's about your daughter," Professor Harlow explained. "Lily has been accepted to the high school program with a full merit scholarship." Joy and pride surged through Grace as she opened the letter and read the formal acceptance. Lily had worked so hard for this opportunity, practicing diligently and maintaining excellent grades despite her intense focus on music. "This is wonderful news," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "She'll be thrilled. She earned it entirely on her own merits," Professor Harlow assured her. "Your performance at the showcase had no bearing on the admissions committee's decision. If anything, they held her to a higher standard because of your connection to the conservatory." Grace nodded, believing him. Lily's talent was genuine, her dedication unwavering. Thank you for bringing this to me personally. There is a certain symmetry to it, Professor Harlow observed. Mother and daughter both finding their place at Westfield, albeit at different stages of life. After he left, Grace sat alone in her studio, the acceptance letter in her lap, the job offer turning over in her mind. How strange life was, with its unexpected turns and second chances. She thought back to that first day 3 months ago, when she had reluctantly played the Rachmaninoff cadenza for a room full of skeptical strangers. If someone had told her then that it would lead to this moment, a teaching career at a prestigious conservatory, and her daughter's acceptance to the program, she would have thought it impossible. When she arrived home that evening, the house was filled with the smell of David's signature pasta sauce and the sound of Lily practicing in the living room. In the months since Grace had begun teaching at Westfield, their family routines had shifted and evolved. David had taken on more household responsibilities without complaint, and Lily had grown more independent, managing her own schedule and schoolwork with increasing maturity. "I'm home," Grace called out, hanging her coat in the entryway. Lily appeared from the living room, still holding her pencil from marking her music. "How are your students today?" "Good," Grace replied with a smile. "And I have some news for you." David emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "What kind of news?" Grace held up the envelope. "Lily, this came for you today." Lily stared at the Westfield letterhead, her eyes widening. "Is that—" "Open it and see," Grace encouraged, handing her the envelope even though she already knew its contents. With trembling fingers, Lily removed the letter and began to read. Her expression transformed from nervous anticipation to pure joy. "I got in, with a full scholarship." David rushed over to embrace his daughter. "I never doubted you for a minute. Congratulations, sweetheart." As Lily danced around the living room in celebration, Grace shared her own news with David. "Professor Harlow offered me a full-time position for next year, teaching both community music school and conservatory students." David's eyebrows rose. "That's a big step up. How do you feel about it?" Grace considered the question carefully. Excited, nervous, a little overwhelmed. It would mean significant changes for all of us. "Good changes," David said firmly. "You've been happier these past 3 months than I've seen you in years. More fulfilled. But the household works just fine with our new arrangements," he interrupted gently. "I've discovered I actually enjoy cooking when I'm not exhausted from work. Lily has become remarkably self-sufficient, and the sky hasn't fallen because you're not personally handling every detail of our lives." Lily, overhearing their conversation, joined them. "Mom, you have to take the job. We could drive to Westfield together every day." Grace laughed at her daughter's enthusiasm. "That's one way to make sure you get to school on time." Later that evening, after dinner had been eaten and the dishes cleared away, Grace found herself alone at the piano. She began to play Debussy's Reverie, a piece whose gentle, flowing quality matched her reflective mood. As the music filled their modest living room, she thought about the journey of the past few months, from the reluctant performer pushed onto a stage to the confident teacher with a growing reputation, from the mother who had set aside her own dreams to support her family, to the woman who was finding a way to integrate her passion for music with her commitment to those she loved. The changes hadn't always been easy. There had been awkward moments. As family roles shifted, difficult conversations about expectations and responsibilities. There had been evenings when she returned home tired from teaching, wondering if she was shortchanging her family. There had been mornings when the weight of balancing it all had seemed overwhelming. But there had also been moments of profound satisfaction, watching a student's face light up with understanding, receiving heartfelt thanks from parents, rediscovering her own musical voice through teaching others. And perhaps most meaningful of all, seeing Lily observe her mother's rekindled relationship with music and professional identity. David appeared in the doorway, listening quietly as she played. When she finished, he joined her on the piano bench. "So," he said, "have you decided about the job offer?" Grace nodded slowly. "I think I have. I want to accept it." "I thought you might," he said with a smile. and I think it's the right choice. It won't always be easy, she cautioned. There will be late evenings, weekend commitments, more responsibility. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy, David replied. But we'll figure it out together just like we always have. He touched one of the piano keys softly. You know, when we first met, I was captivated by your playing. I used to sit in the back row of the recital hall at Eastman just to hear you practice. Even then, I knew music was essential to who you are. I never knew that, Grace said, surprised. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel guilty about the choices we made together, David explained. But I've always hoped you'd find your way back to it somehow. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, grateful for his understanding and support. It's strange, she said softly. 3 months ago, I was terrified to play in public again. Now I can't imagine not sharing music in some way every day. That's because you're finally doing what you were meant to do, he said simply, not exactly the way you might have imagined at 20, but in a way that incorporates everything you've learned and experienced since then. From the kitchen came the sound of Lily's voice on the phone, excitedly telling a friend about her acceptance to Westfield. Her happiness was palpable, her future full of promise. Grace smiled, recognizing that her own future now held new promise as well. The path ahead would require balance and adjustment, patience and flexibility from all of them, but it would also bring fulfillment and purpose, a chance to share her gift in ways she had never anticipated. The elite conservatory teachers who had once forced a humble wife to play a difficult piano piece could never have predicted where that moment would lead. Not just to a stunning performance that night, but to a transformation that continued to unfold, note by note, day by day, reshaping not only her life but the lives of the students who would learn from her experience and wisdom in the years to come. Grace placed her hands on the keys again and began to play, not for an audience this time, but for herself, for the pure joy of making music. The melody rose and fell, telling a story of loss and rediscovery, of dreams deferred and dreams reimagined. Her story, a story still being written, one measure at a time.